everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Primrose ZJBima and I create content about research, running and mindfulness. Today's episode is of course about research as I will be focusing on my top 10 publications. I will tell you about their titles. I will tell you who I co-authored with if I wrote with someone else. I will tell you about who called for the papers, what they sought after. And I'll also reflect on what I believe were the benefits of writing those papers. So in academia, it is a requirement for one to publish, whether journal articles, book chapters, as well as books. Some even go beyond by producing what we call op-ed articles through media channels. I will be solely focusing on what I've written as journal submissions as well as book chapters. I've never written a book, sadly. I promise I should have one by 2025. Now, the importance of research is that it has to be published following review by experts in the field, usually referred to as peer reviewers. And oftentimes these reviewers are unknown to you as the writer. Journal articles are usually defined as a key form of publication whereby review processes are quite thorough and more rigorous. Usually book chapters are sought after because someone got a grant or funds to produce a book, and so they're under pressure to come up with people that will submit book chapters to them. So usually the peer review processes are a bit more lenient because publication is more or less guaranteed. Having a book, I think it's a big deal because you need loads of funding, and I think books are considered as something that is on a higher level. So it's books, it's journal articles, and then book chapters. I stand to be corrected, but this is the reality that I have experienced thus far. So my first publication was a journal article which I co-authored with my honors supervisor. I was the first author because the paper was based on my own honors research. I had undertaken this research on my own and written an honors research project based on it. She, of course, stepped in to help me to write in the format that was required by the Journal of Psychology in Africa. And she helped me so much when it came to the corrections because they were so overwhelming. I had never before submitted any paper for reviewers to look at it. And the people that reviewed this submission were, authors I had been reading about since like first year gender studies, and all of a sudden I'm like in my fourth year of studying gender and these gurus are critiquing my work. Hectic. So anyway, the benefit was that my honor supervisor saw that my work was going to be well received. Almost because I did my research on Africa-based women who have made the decision to not have children, what we categorize in feminism as women that have made the child-free choice. This at the time, and I believe till date, is still an under-researched phenomenon. Usually when we think about women who don't have children, we focus on childlessness. And that usually refers to people that want to have children, but unfortunately for a wide range of reasons or one reason, cannot have children. So why was this topic important? When we speak about sexual and reproductive health rights, it's about the decision to choose if, when, and how to reproduce, right? When we are speaking about reproduction. And the if part of this phrase often goes under-researched and unrecognized. So I was focusing on women that have thought about whether or not they want to reproduce and they decided it's not for them. And what I liked about this research is that I stepped out of my own shell. It's a topic I'd never thought about before, and I found a lot of insights whilst I was doing my interviews, because interviews were my form of data collection. So I've already stated why this paper was relevant in terms of its purpose for academia. I was filling in a gap in terms of research because there was little knowledge on this demographic, and that still persists. As a result, I think it is one of my most cited publications, and I really want to say thank you to my honor supervisor. I don't know if she watches my content, but yes, Dr. Rochelle Chadwick, because she actually encouraged me to write. And when the article came back, having been reviewed and accepted on condition that I had to do revisions, she helped me through them because those processes can be very overwhelming. And being an honor student at that stage, I don't think I personally had the capacity to write on my own. So I'm really grateful that I had to work with someone for my very first submission. Some of the benefits, I think, is that this article got more people talking, right? Stirring conversations around child free choice, particularly in the South African context. And it also helped some people to relate because you could find yourself as a colored woman or as a black woman, even as a white woman in this research, or as an Africa or South Africa based woman in this particular research, thereby demystifying also the myth that the African continent is all about let's reproduce, and there's people that, don't exercise their own agency in terms of deciding not to have children, particularly women, because oftentimes womanhood is closely tied to you reproducing. And so womanhood is closely tied to motherhood. But we have different types of femininities, and not having children does not nullify your value as a woman. All right, before I start chopping English, let me move on to my next article. So, my next article was on the inefficiency and ineffectiveness that occurs owing to poor border management systems, particularly during peak seasons. So, this is based on data that I collected at the Zimbabwean border during the peak season, Christmas season, that is when I was traveling with my family. To be quite honest, I never thought about writing about such, but we were in a queue for the longest time. And my father was like, we could actually write a paper based on this experience. I had swollen legs, but my brain was not swollen. We were alert the whole time because we needed to move. So I collected data. After the holidays, we got back home, and my father and I started writing. He is in the business field, and I'm from the social sciences. And I had done a research project for my master's that focused on migration management. So I was quite clued up on issues around the movement of persons. I had to self-educate myself around border management. There was a lot of literature on that, but there were no specific articles that spoke about border management during peak periods, particularly at the Beitbridge border post between Zimbabwe and South Africa, which I believe is the busiest border in the Southern African context. And it is a border which, is a subject of much contestation. Upgrades have been done. South Africa now has a border management authority to strengthen their management of the area, but I still believe that more can be done. So I believe that I contributed to a body of emerging knowledge around this area. And of course, I collaborated with my father, who is an expert in business. So he was supposed to add insights relating to how this would affect, the cost of doing business, the cost of trade, amongst other factors. So it was an amazing collaboration, and it was not my call, like I said. So this was my second time writing a journal article, and also someone else initiated. But in this case, I was not the first author. My father was, because the paper was submitted to a journal in the business field, and it had more of a business orientation than a social science orientation. However, that is subject to much debate. That paper, I believe, opened many doors for me, surprisingly. Although it was published in 2018, around 2020, I was invited to be part of a panel of esteemed speakers. This included ministers, diplomats, amongst other experts in the fields of trade and migration management. And I managed to present the results from that paper, but also updated by giving, current insights at the time in 2020 on what it meant to do trade or travel through these borders, and some of the factors that could have been affecting movement of persons as well as goods, particularly in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was invited by Chatham House to participate in a virtual, of course, because it was during COVID, in a virtual conference. And I believe that opened more doors for me, because when COVID was about to end around 2022, I managed to go to Lusaka in Zambia, where I had been asked to present a paper on the importance of one-stop border posts to facilitate ease of trade within the COMESA region, which covers parts of East and Southern Africa. So I went there as an expert in the field, and of course it required that I undertake further research because of course what I wrote in 2018 was outdated. I undertook further research by interviewing people who included experts who work in border management spaces, as well as people who facilitate the movement of persons, immigration officials, as well as people that facilitate business forms of movement. For example, people working for customs. So that really helped me in terms of nourishing my intellect. And although I was not an expert on border management or the movement of persons, I gained a new skill and I managed to interact with a wide range of scholars on different topics aside from trade, because that conference looked at many more factors that were linked to politics in the COMESA region. So my third article was on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on small to medium enterprises, with a specific focus on the city of Cape Town. Of course, this data was collected during the COVID-19 period, so I was limited in terms of the people I could reach out to because they had to have some form of internet access for me to interact with them. Again, this paper was co-authored with my father, who is a business specialist. I think we both thought about writing this paper, and I did most of the data collection. But because, again, business is not my thing, he came in with the theory, the history, the legal background. And so he was, again, the first author, and I was second author. What this did for me was it helped me because at the time I was teaching courses on gender, and I managed to fuse my research at the time with analysis on the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the gendered impact of the pandemic on women who were running businesses in the small to medium enterprise sector. So this research was relevant because when small to medium enterprises are hit with shocks or negative impacts in relation to pandemics or to economic crisis, they are often under-researched and they usually don't receive relief or funds from the government. And even if they do, they usually struggle when it comes to survival. So it was definitely a beneficial addition to knowledge. And I also added my gender lens to this business paper because, of course, I'm all about gender and transformation. This publication helped me because at the time I was teaching a course on gender and the politics of development. I managed to come up with a concept linked to the socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I used both the research that I was conducting for this paper, as well as the planning that I had on looking at the gendered impact of the pandemic at the time. And although this paper didn't get me invited to talk or present elsewhere, it is one of my most read papers, and it's still being cited today. So it was really important, I believe. Moving on to number 4. So 2020, I was busy minding my own business, trying to make sure that I complete my PhD before COVID kills me, because yes, I was scared, to die from the pandemic. And my supervisor told me that he was required to submit a book chapter on African Union and European Union relations. That for me was a terra incognita, meaning that I had never explored research in that area. And although I had just started teaching a course on global governance, which looked at the African Union's relations with the European Union, I wasn't well versed in that area. So I took up the challenge. I was like, you know what? I can do the research with you and be your co-author. So that's how I ended up being the co-author of a book chapter on African Union and European Union relations. The benefit of this was that because the book was already, commissioned for by Routledge, it was going to be published. And although it took a year of back and forth between us and the reviewers, we ended up having the chapter and it was published. And I was so grateful because throughout the writing process, my supervisor provided a lot of guidance to me in terms of how to apply theory to case studies, because that had always been my weakness. that had always been my fear when it came to, will I even become a PhD holder? Because I'm quite shaky when it comes to marrying theory to case studies. All right. So, in terms of the opportunities that this chapter presented to me, I think, obviously, visibility in academia. This was also part of a volume that many people were waiting for. Routledge has a good reputation. So, some people will just come across your article because it is published by the right publisher or by the excellent people, which I quite hate about academia. But, when you make it into those books, then it's a positive note for you. So it also helped my teaching because I was teaching a course in global governance. So it sharpened my thoughts. It also helped me to think more critically about the perspectives that have been raised over the years by different thinkers through their writings or through their pronouncements in policy statements or at conferences or through their government policies. So moving on to my fifth submission. My fifth submission was sought after. I was approached. I believe this person approached me via LinkedIn, maybe because of work that I had done prior, but I had not written about this topic. It's something I speak about via my YouTube channel. So I was asked to write a paper on African women in international relations, and I chose to write about the importance of having more African women in global governance institutions such as your World Bank, the United Nations, and its various agencies, because those are institutions where decisions are made and where resources are distributed in terms of planning and budgeting. And if you don't have more women there, it's sort of like a shortfall, right? Because if we're not at the top in terms of decision making, we are unlikely to get some of our goals actualized. So I wrote about that. It was for International Relations, which I stand to be corrected, but is one of the major platforms for students or scholars beyond just students. I still identify as a scholar, even though I'm a postdoctoral research fellow. So scholars in international relations often read articles that are submitted to International Relations. So I believe that gave me an international platform because I ended up being invited to several platforms, including in the United Kingdom, which was virtual because this was still during COVID-19, where I spoke about African women in international relations, not only the African women who play roles in institutions of global governance, but I also placed emphasis on African women in political roles as ministers and to some extent as members of parliament. I also emphasized the role of African women in international relations who are academics. I am one of them. So that gave me visibility. That helped me to get onto international platforms for information exchange. And obviously, I am also contributing to a growing field of study. People are now researching on feminist foreign policies. People are now focusing more on thinking about what it means for African women to be in international relations. And one of the benefits of me having written that article, I believe, was I was recently approached to write a chapter on African women in diplomacy. So what you research on and write about, and if it gets published, can help you to get your next publication out. Okay, now moving on to number 6. This is something I recently wrote, which is a review article submitted to a journal. This was sought after. They approached me. They say that they heard about me and my work in gender through someone I've worked with before. So don't burn bridges. Hey, when you leave workspaces, make sure you still have good relations with people. So I reviewed a book which was on the politics of gender reform in relation to laws in the West African context. So this was so nice. I'd never reviewed a book before for academic publication purposes. It got a straight acceptance. I just had to do minor corrections in terms of grammar and spelling and to clarify one or two issues. And it was my first sole authored journal submission. And this only happened this year. So the journey has been long and arduous. What I liked about this article is that it helped me to start thinking about how gender and legal reforms, interact within the Southern African context. And when I was invited to a workshop on women and legal histories in Germany, Frankfurt this year, I managed to develop a paper that focused on gender, marriage, and legal reforms within the Zimbabwean context, which is my country of birth and my country of citizenship. So I managed to do research just beyond the West African context, which the book referred to, which is a good angle because in research, you're supposed to feed into what has been researched. And if it's under research in another context, try and develop new research in that particular area. I will move on to the seventh one. This is a publication on the African Union's role in promoting economic development on the continent. This was published earlier this year. I co-authored once again with my master's/PhD supervisor. I haven't mentioned his name at this point. This is Professor John Akokpari. Thank you so much. I identify him as my academic father. So this publication was sought after by the Institute for Security Studies. There was a lot of back and forth because things kept changing. Literally, it took between 2020 and 2022, December, if I'm not mistaken, even some parts of like the beginning of 2023 to correct some areas and, clarify because, COVID-19, yes, had an impact, but, the impact kept changing from time to time because when we were looking at the African Union's contribution to economic development on the continent, we were not only looking at the economy on its own, we were looking at health, we were looking at agriculture, we were looking at trade, and we were also looking at the education sector. So a lot of updating kept, being done. Now, the benefits that I believe have come out of this article thus far, I was invited to the book launch where I presented an analysis of that particular chapter as well as another chapter that was almost similar to ours, but that chapter looked at the African Union's role in terms of promoting relations with institutions outside the continent. Now, remember, I had already written a chapter before on African Union and European Union relations, so I was well versed to actually conduct an analysis of that particular chapter as well as to appreciate what that chapter added in terms of current knowledge at the time, because already 2 years had passed after I wrote the article on African Union, European Union relations, and me now having to review an article on the African Union's interlocutory role in terms of engaging with extra-African actors. Now, I shall move on to the next one, which is number 8. A paper, journal submission on African solutions to African problems. This is likely to get published in 2024, but everything has been ironed out. The back and forth and the sending to the reviewers is done. This was sought after by a Canada-based journal in international relations. So I think this will probably be my most elite submission. Unfortunately, in academia, the Western journals usually have an elite status. So it should be in a journal that focuses on security, if I'm not mistaken, global security. And I co-authored this once again with my master's/PhD supervisor, Professor John Akokpari. And in terms of the purpose of this paper, having written about the African Union's contribution to economic development, having written about the African Union's relations with the European Union, I was now literally an expert on the African Union and diplomacy within this particular institution. So this paper was required because, of course, the African Union celebrated its 20th anniversary following its reformation in 2002 from the Organization of African Unity, which had been formed in 1963. So it was majorly a review of most of what I had written prior and also of new and emerging issues. For example, even though the chapter had been accepted and things were cleaned out, when the African Union was announced as a new member to the G20, we had to make a contribution on the implications on Africa being part of the G20. So it's going to help me in terms of visibility. It's going to help in terms of keeping up with the trends in global development as well as global governance. And I am yet to see, some of the greater benefits because the article is not yet out. Now, my number 9 is something I'm currently working on, and I think it resonates with my passion. It is a book chapter on African women in diplomacy. I'm going to be doing the corrections pretty soon, submitting them on the 30th of November. I can't give much details, I can't divulge much in terms of who approached me, where it's going to be published because it's a work in progress. But good thing is it is going to be published. So I think that this article is very important because we need more knowledge about the experiences that women encounter within diplomacy and in political spaces. These are spaces that are heavily masculinized in terms of their culture, because diplomacy and politics are still heavily, to a large extent, patriarchal and mostly driven by men. I believe that this article will touch to some extent on some of the strategies that women in these sectors employ in terms of survival, in terms of reframing the sector, and in terms of ensuring that women that come into the spaces now and in the future have better experiences. So this is honestly a contribution to ongoing knowledge, and the focus on Africa hits home because I am an African woman and I hope to be an African woman in diplomacy in the future. And if not, I am gladly here as someone who has put forward the stories of African women in diplomacy, and hopefully that will inform reform processes. I can't speak about the benefits of this paper once again because it has not yet been published. So, moving on to the 10th and last one that I will be reflecting on today is, it's not yet a paper. I recently submitted to the University of Namibia. They have an institute that called for paper submissions that look at migration management, security, as well as labor within the Southern African context, if I'm not mistaken. And I decided to revisit my master's thesis topic. So funny enough, I've never written anything based on my master's thesis. So I decided that I was going to, raise the dead. In Shona, they say kumutsa chituna when they're referring to when you look at an old academic piece of work, and you add spice to it and add currency to it. So I'm doing this with my own work, by the way. For my master's, I focused on what was called at the time the Zimbabwe Special Permit, a successor to what was called the Dispensation of Zimbabwe's Permit, so the ZSP and the DZP. These permits were later succeeded by a hot topic today, which is called the Zimbabwe Exemption Permits, the ZEPs. And there's been a lot going on ever since 2016 when I submitted my thesis, a lot of court battles. So I will be writing a paper that looks at the implications of the special permits and also looks at the implications of how debates around the renewal or non-renewal of these permits have led to people living in limbo, So people in anthropology refer to liminality in terms of high levels of uncertainty. And I also speak in this paper about the implications of having to go through permit renewals, not knowing if your permit is going to come, and also, the uncertainty that comes with living in a country for more than 10 years and then being told that you eventually have to just return to your country because no permanent residency is going to be offered to you and whatnot. So I am still doing the groundwork. Like I said, I wrote about the DZP and ZSP permits, so I need to brush up my act in terms of doing research on the ZEP so that when I do present my paper in terms of looking at how South Africa's issuing of special permits to Zimbabweans helped in terms of migration management and also how it, is linked to the labor sector of South Africa, I am going to do lots of research. I don't know where I'm going now because I'm rambling. It's something that I'm not well versed at the moment. So that will be my 10th submission. My master's, is heavily cited because it's available online. So I think I would be a good person. I'll be in a good position to do thorough justice to my work by building up on it and adding on new and emerging knowledge. The danger with this paper is that the debates are going on. We'll probably be still in the courts by 2024, hopefully not 2025. So it is going to be quite a challenge. The benefits that will come out of this paper, I don't know, but I think it will help me to contribute to knowledge within migration management, within the Southern African context, and also more broadly globally, because migration is a hot topic. Now, to sum up my discussion today, I wrote down, 4 key points in terms of what I believe are important strategies to think about when you're writing a research paper, whether you are writing for submission in terms of a book chapter, or a journal submission. Number one, looking out for topics that are under researched. So I gave my example on child-free choice in Africa. And also, I believe that by writing on African women in international relations, in politics, and diplomacy, I am also adding to knowledge in under-researched areas. So the second one is critical topics, what some people may want to refer to as hot topics at a particular time. So writing about, the impact of COVID-19 on small to medium enterprises during the COVID-19 pandemic, during the height of the pandemic. Some critical or hot topics, could include, for example, right now, the Russia-Ukraine war. You could also be writing about the Palestinian crisis. So some people also, when it comes to critical topics, still heavily focus on China-Africa relations. And I think another topic that comes into my mind is also gender-based violence, right? But I think that some of these do fall into a category that we call evergreen topics, which is number 3. So evergreen topics are topics that likely, people will always look back and say, what is happening? What was happening? What is happening? What can we, think about how these trends will go in the future? In my case, migration management. Migration management is part of human life. We can't escape it. We can't evade it. The second one I can think about is around reproduction, right? When you're writing about sexual and reproductive health rights, when you're writing also about border management, I think it's important because it's also linked to migration. It's also linked to trade. Trade will forever be there. Even when we think about harsh migration, rules and whatnot, but what about border management? What about transport? What about trade amongst nations? Also, I think gender in international relations and politics will always be topics that will be evergreen because we are moving forward. We are not supposed to be going back. Other evergreen topics, I think the small to medium enterprises, particularly on the African continent, already I said trade is important, but also a lot of people are self-employed or are enterprising in different sectors on a small or medium based, sector in terms of their enterprise. And also, we can think about the climate change agenda. It is something that is ongoing, evergreen, linked to the climate. So the last one, which is number 4, submissions should be linked to what I call timeliness or being sought after. I think for me, my advantage has been that people have actually approached me for submissions, particularly recently. I don't know if it's because I do a lot of yep on YouTube and LinkedIn, but whatever is happening, it's working in my favor. It's also because, I've not burnt bridges with former employers who were colleagues when I was lecturing at the University of Cape Town, because I've then had to submit because I was invited, because someone who knows someone was like, Primrose is the right person to go for this particular type of writing. So the African Union, timely sought after. That's how I ended up writing a lot of articles about the African Union in particular. Diplomacy is my area. Diplomacy will always exist because of interstate relations. So also timely sought after, but I think also falls even into the evergreen and the critical areas that I mentioned. So honestly speaking, I've enjoyed being a researcher. I've had articles that were rejected, and because here I do not entertain negativity, I did not draw on them. Hence my presentation on my best 10 submissions. I hope that you found this insightful. If you've got anything to add or ask, feel free to use the comment section. If you don't want to use the comment section, you can always email me. I've also put down my email under the description box. It is pzjbmaconsulting@gmail.com. I do not charge anything for people who ask me questions because I believe that by answering people's questions, it also helps me to interact with topics and also to think deeper about issues and even to exchange information with those particular individuals. I'm done with talking for the day. It's goodbye for now. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe if you've not done so yet. And don't forget to share my content with relevant people as well. Thank you once again. Bye.